the anti-realist wants to say something like, okay, yeah, the universe as it is, like, yeah, maybe that's out there, maybe that's something that's happening, but that universe as it is doesn't have any a priori cuts in it. So the universe isn't broken down into the elements of scientific discourse. It's not like the universe is broken down into electrons and fields and geometries and so on. And the anti-realist wants to appeal to this fact that throughout history we've seen these stories change enormously. And the anti-realist would maybe even say, well, yeah, the mathematical structure is preserved, but what are you describing with that structure? What you're describing, that structure, that mathematical structure, is just a story that's helping you do experiments. That's it. It has nothing to do, that structure isn't honing in or fitting some structure out there in the universe. That structure is kind of like a tool, it's like a hammer, it's a tool that you're building to do a task.
So I guess I would be very skeptical of both the anti-realists and the realists. I guess as you know, I lean more to like the sort of subjective side of things. I don't know if it's actually telling, like, for all I know for all I know that is the real story of the universe, and for all I know is this is a story that we've made up that's extremely helpful for us to do calculations, right? Like, I don't know the answer, and you don't know the answer.
Let me give you a metaphor from Hillary Lawson to maybe cash out sort of what I mean by all of this. So imagine that you live in a bunker and you have a video camera and you can see some flags outside. And maybe you have some knobs in front of you and you notice that turning the knob one way or another influences the motion of the flags outside. And so you get hard to work in your bunker and you come up with theories that relate the turning of the knobs to the motion of the flags, and maybe you get a theory that works really well for you. That theory wouldn't tell you about the wind that was moving the flags. Not necessarily, right? That theory wouldn't necessarily. If the flags were embedded in a world where there was windstorms and the knobs you're turning are actually like fans or fins or things that expose the flags to wind coming from different directions, that might not be involved at all in the theory that you come up with. All your theory has to do is relate accurately the motion of the knobs to the motion of the flags. And it doesn't need to talk about wind at all. So that's kind of a metaphor for, I think, what anti-realists are saying about the world. They're saying, the world as it is could be out there. It could have divisions. It could not have divisions. A priori, we don't know what those divisions would be. And when I say divisions, I mean dividing the universe up into things like atoms and molecules and elements and fields and that kind of thing. Whatever way you want to sort of cut up the data of the universe that you're receiving. Those cuts are not out there a priori. They don't need to be out there a priori. What we are doing when we undertake the project of science is we're sort of, Lawson uses this word closure. We're closing the openness of the world, So I look up at the sky and I say to you, oh, well, these stars over here that look a bit like a person, a hunter, I'll call those stars Orion. And once I've done that, I can say to you, well, look at that star over there. That's just a bit to the right of Orion. Well, does that mean Orion is out there in the universe as a sort of ontological object of reality? No, it's just a happenstance of my sense data of the night sky and my particular human brain's ability to make patterns that you and I both picked out that pattern. And then we said, oh, I can use that pattern to do things that are useful for us in the world. But that doesn't mean that Orion, the constellation, was sort of carved into the rock of reality outside of our little story that we're telling to help us navigate our boat or whatever it is that we're trying to do.
So is it like an implausibility statement that I mean, are you basically saying what I said in the sense that, I mean, that could be what's happening, but like it's probably, are you saying like, just because the story works doesn't mean it actually relates to what's actually happening?
Yeah, I think that's really the conservative statement of the position. I don't want to put a number on how likely one way or another any particular. I don't even know how you'd put a sort of distribution on the question.
We know the answer to that. This channel is based off of the answer.
This is the entree point of Janesians.
Yes, everyone, if you've made it to this point in the video, you should go watch my videos on entropy and Jane's principle of maximum entropy. Mostly a joke. I don't think you should. I mean, it's going to give you no information if you ask the principle of maximum entropy about things like this, because you can't actually test these things. These are untestable statements, so it's kind of a useless application. But plug to the, you know, epistemic interpretation of StatMech.
I think, I think anti-realism is really challenging, and I think it's actually really annoying for a lot of people who study physics because, again, you know, physicists and I suspect a lot of scientists working in the so-called hard sciences, you know, the kind of sciences where you can do very controlled, reproducible experiments. This is all very tedious, I think, to them in a professional sense because it just does not matter to the problems they're trying to solve, and yet, underlying the methodology of their solutions, you know, every scientist holds in their head some philosophy of science, whether they realize it or not. If you push any scientist, they have to begin to tell you what they think is happening. Otherwise, you know, what are you doing? You know, you're trying to come up with a story about what's going on in the world. So I think that this anti-realist position is very interesting because it comes at it from a very different perspective, and it really challenges it in some ways. You know, it anti-realism, right? Like it is the exact opposite of that position. Maybe say when I was 12 years old, that I kind of believed this idea that, you know, science is actually the arbiter of truth and reality and so on. And so then the question becomes, well, can we reconcile all? Is there a sort of framework of thinking that allows us to reconcile all these different ways of approaching this problem? And I guess here is where we sort of enter this discussion of what we call pragmatism, or maybe neo-pragmatism. So in the late 19th century, this guy Charles Peirce, and then a little bit later, this guy William James, really developed this idea of pragmatism, and it had a real clear articulation, I think, in the work of Richard Rorty, who is a sort of recent philosopher in working in many areas. And you know, the basics of the pragmatist position are that, you know, truth is something that is internal to a vocabulary that we use about the world. You know, so I use a vocabulary of science, I use a vocabulary of art, I use a vocabulary of religion. And all these vocabularies, like tools, are honed to one task or another. And it is that task to which the vocabulary has been suited that defines the notion of truth. Truth comes down to a utility, basically. And so in science, for the person working in their lab, you know, truth is whatever it needs to be to get you to better technology or better experiments or a more cohesive worldview. Or, you know, for a Catholic, you know, truth is whatever it needs to be for you to fulfill your spiritual project, whatever that project looks like for you. And so pragmatism is it's almost kind of like a meta philosophy. It's almost like a philosophy of philosophies, you know, that kind of says that, you know, truth with a capital T, this thing that science claims to be seeking in the first place, just doesn't seem to be a very coherent idea. It's not really clear what that would even mean. Even though we've been looking for it for thousands of years in Western philosophy, we don't seem to be any closer to finding it today than we were like 3,000 years ago. So maybe we should just stop caring so much about truth with a capital T, reality as it is, you know, the absolute truth of the universe. And we should just be comfortable with the fact that we're limited to speaking about truth only ever with respect to a particular end or a particular application. And somehow all of these philosophies of science that we've been discussing, I think, somehow sort of fall in and kind of it can be sort of understood through this lens a little bit.